Hey everyone, welcome back into the Magic the Gathering unofficial audiobooks podcast. Phil Dawson here, and I get notifications when the podcast gets a review, and we got a few the last 2 weeks, and they really made my day. I got some good messages that made my day as well, and I'm just very grateful for all of you that are here and all of us enjoying this ride together. Also, I'm starting to plan what we're going to do while I'm in the States for 3 weeks. I'm not sure what that is yet, so just stay tuned to the Discord. Patrons will know first. Speaking of that, I want to thank my patrons, all of you, including our newest, Michael. Thank you so much for joining as a content human. Plus, another one of our patrons hit the $100 mark, meaning that we're down to only 3 Shadowbox cubes left. The wonderful designs, custom-built cubes with a great scene of Urza and Mishra playing Friday Night Magic. You can see even more epic scenes from movies, video games, anime, and more, all in beautifully custom-built Shadowbox cubes at the Etsy shop, etsy.com/shop/apes-in-capes. Plus, if you use the code MAGIC on your order, you get 10% off. So go do that and support the show by supporting creators we support here. Again, etsy.com/shop/apes-in-capes. Okay, I think that's it. Love you all. Thanks for being here. Phil and Sendai on Twitter or Instagram. You're the best. Let's go! Chapter 16. Passing through the gatehouse, its gleaming white spires thrusting upward into a blue sky, Ellen entered the flagstone-paved courtyard of Capuchin Manor. She carried a collection of scrolls bundled loosely under one arm, occasionally dropping one and having to stoop for it. They were taxation estimates for local villages. No matter how important they might be, especially this year, she couldn't bring herself to invest much enthusiasm. Why should she care how well the crops came in, so long as the farmer caste supplied the manor with plenty? Instead of the scrolls, her hand itched for the comfortable feel of a sword hilt, for the chance to prove herself. Strange creatures stalked Capuchin lands these days. Monsters, some called them, of black flesh and metal with a taste for devastation. Farms had been left in ruins, and the people were frightened. Some of the clan's best warriors had already taken to the field, leading bands of Benalish soldiers as they tried to protect harvests and clear Capuchin territory of these things. Only some of the best, though, because she hadn't been considered. Even in the noble Benalish clans, one's position was so often determined beforehand. Since the marriage of Jaffrey Capuchin and Mira Ortovi, her great-grandparents, Ellen's family line had been relegated to minor status in an attempt to contain any attempts by Clan Ortovi to abuse the relationship. Ellen's parents followed a similar course as taxation officials and village magistrates and minor diplomats depending on the year and needs of the clan. Ellen had been born different. She challenged the rules whenever possible, stubbornly pushing forward. Whenever a person of higher stature made a mistake, they turned around to find her ready to assume the greater position. She learned the ways of the sword, drawn to weapons like pieces of metal to lodestone. Sometimes she felt the metal called to her, and feeling she could not shake as if a piece of her were missing. Ellen heard a whisper at the back of her mind, felt a dark presence, seconds before her sharp ears picked up the sound of the booted feet hammering against the bleached flagstone courtyard. Shouts of alarm echoed through the manor, followed by a screeching snarl. Ellen turned away from the manor front, walking swiftly at first, and then running for the corner, a trail of scrolls bouncing on the flagstones behind her. She slid around the east side of the great building where the manor's shadow fell just as 3 guards raced up from the other direction to catch the creature between them and her. The semblance of a young dragon, it was like nothing Ellen had ever heard described. 5 feet at the shoulder, the creature's leathery wings stretched up another 3 feet over its mutilated back. Its head and neck were devoid of flesh or muscle, clean down to the bone. Thin metal cables connected the eye socket to the base of the skull, and long, coarse hair sprouted from the thick scale armoring its shoulders. Its 4 legs and long, barbed tail were spot-covered with muscle and some skin, but in several areas ran uncovered down to bone or steel replacement. It screamed again, the chilling screech of metal knives scored against slate. 2 nobles lay on the bleached flagstone, throats and chests clawed open, staining the ground with Capuchin blood. A 3rd figure was pinned up against the manor wall by the creature's bulk, robes tattered and bloody but obviously still alive as he tried to crawl past. The soldiers attempted to drive the monstrous form back. It struck out with its metal-tipped claws, shredding the arm of one soldier who dropped his sword and staggered away, screaming shrilly for the pain. Ellen's gaze flickered toward the abandoned weapon. Part of her, eager to seize it, joined the battle, while another part stood immobile, unwilling. This creature was from one of her recurring nightmares from as far back as she could recall, turned from imagined image to deadly reality in front of her. Ellen might not have broken from her trance, torn between loyalty and a strange, unholy sense of fear and familiarity for the creature. But then the beast reared back, one massive back leg coming down on the fallen noble and pinning his leg against the ground. He cried out in pain, hands grasping at his leg to pull it free. Ellen recognized him, even past the smears of blood masking his face. So did one of the guards. "Leader Persian!" he yelled. It was the leader of their clan. The warrior didn't hesitate. "Capuchin!" he yelled out in a battle cry, rushing forward. The dragon beast's tail whipped around and impaled him, the tail's bladed tip driving through his midsection and thrusting out of his back. The danger to her clan leader and sacrifice of the guard broke Ellen's catatonic state. She dove forward, snatched up the fallen sword, and rolled to her feet as the creature cast away the broken body. The leather grip felt strange, too soft, but the balance was familiar. She moved shoulder to shoulder with the remaining guard, adding her swordplay to his. Checking one slash, Ellen almost lost her sword as it vibrated madly in her hand. It felt as if she had slashed her sword into a steel post. As one, they advanced, forcing the beast back from their fallen clansmen. So close to the creature, Ellen could smell the reek of oil, at once foul and enticing. With a last swipe at the two sword-bearing humans, the dragon beast turned and held them at bay with violent slashes of its bladed tail. Its scream resounded with pure fury and hatred as it reared over Persian. It slashed down once, twice. The creature's head bobbed in time to its clawing, always keeping its attention divided between the fallen noble and the two wielding swords. The guard standing next to Ellen moved toward the beast, and she followed. The creature turned with incredible agility. Its claws struck out, rending long mortal furrows down the guard's face and chest, even as its tail swiped deeply across both legs. His attention diverted for a crucial second, Ellen slipped past and ran her sword through the dangling loops of the metal cable running from the creature's eye sockets to the base of its skull. She thrust downward with all her strength, pressing her full weight behind the stroke. The cables parted, and the metallic screech of the dragon beast's pain half deafened her. She stumbled forward, fell, and rolled out of the way. A slashing breeze brushed at her hair. The creature's long tail, barbed with dagger-sized blades, whipsawed the air over her. Ellen tried to bury herself down into the flagstones, thankful the beast could no longer see her. The furious beat of wings buffeted her, digging grit out from between the flagstones and dusting it into the air. With a screech of rage, the blinded beast took to the air as new guards ran around the corner, weapons drawn. Ellen rolled over to Percy inside, her breath coming in short, gasping fits. She felt as if she passed a test of sorts, though to pick at the thought any more brought only confusion. Instead, she checked her clan leader for life and found him staring at her with guarded eyes. One side of his face bore a parallel set of deep scars ripped through his cheek. He nodded a cautious greeting to her. "My thanks, Ellen Capuchin." She nodded back, not trusting her voice just yet. Ellen stood up and walked over to a fallen guard. She stripped him of his sword belt and buckled it over her tunic, ramming the sword home, the weight of its steel comfortable on her hip. She moved back to where the soldiers were applying pressure to Persian's open wounds. "More of those creatures are out there," she said simply, knowing it to be true. "I will take charge of a band and hunt them." Ellen knew that further tests awaited her. Persian paused, winced as a new bandage was applied over his leg, then looked skyward for the retreating creature that had taken the lives of 5 other Capuchin. He nodded to himself. "Yes," he finally said. "You will." The village of Devas spread along the river, the normally white stone bathed in pink in the late afternoon sunlight. Stubble fields led away from the settlement as far as the eye could see. The harvesting season in Benalia had just ended. A few mist stalks of grain wafted in the warm breeze that drifted in off the western plains. The high-fluted columns flanking Devas's gates cast long shadows east over the parade grounds established just outside the walls. Those shadows ended in winged silhouettes, platforms up high occupied by a pair of sentries who watched the surrounding lands with a hawk's gaze. The bulk of Devas' martial force gathered outside the white oak gates for a training session. Archers tacked paper targets over bales of straw. They practiced long flights in which arrows fell from the sky in a thick, steel-tipped rain. The house guard worked with sword and halberd, their dance as graceful as it would be deadly. By counterpoint, lancemen thundered by on the plains-bred Eponese. It was an impressive sight and one the Saren refugees allowed few to witness. Lyane gauged the sky, judging another 30 minutes of good light left. Raising fingers to her lips, she blew a shrill whistle, then circled one arm overhead and pointed toward the archers who would need more time to gather their equipment together. They set about picking arrows out of the bales in the ground. Lyane looked back to her soldier under instruction and frowned lightly at the sword he rested, point first into the ground. "It's not meant for you, Isark. Again, another pass." The young Isark did not bother coming back to attention, but he rubbed the blunt point against his leggings to clean it. "Apologies, Marshal. Won't happen again." He grimaced his false contrition toward Karn. Lyane hid a deeper frown at the youth's somber spirit. As he came back in guard, she focused her attention on his every movement, watching for a mistake. His body suddenly taut with lean but well-toned muscle, and the youth nodded a reluctant readiness to his two sparring partners. As the two young home guard attacked with fluid sword strokes, Isark turned one blade into the other, fouling both. He checked his own answer cut short, leaping back to avoid the swift response of one assailant. All three paced an uneven circle, the two guards never allowing the young man a respite, and Isark always wary of allowing them to split apart to trap him.
"How's he doing?"
Karn asked, the golem's deep voice reminding Lyane of the rumble of distant thunder drifting across the plains. "Well, it would appear." Lyane pulled a cloth from the belt of her training leathers and dabbed away sweat built up from her own exertions in practice. Her lips were salty with residue. "Adequate," she said. Rarely did she take on a Darmanarian. Isark's training came at Karn's behest, the marshal remembering the time when Urza Planeswalker had rescued so many of her people, herself included, from the decaying plane that had been Sarah's realm. Karn had been there, and Lyane understood the debt owed all who risked their lives to bring them away from the Phyrexian infestation. Once she had tried explaining this to the Silver Golem, only to find that he knew nothing of the episode except from brief historical notes Urza left for him at 10-year intervals. In fact, Karn's return to Devis every few decades always came in the same manner, as if he'd never been to the settlement before. He would simply arrive with a new student, asking the Sarens to please instruct him or her in combat, until now always a young noble. Lyane remembered her sorrow learning that Karn's memory had been capped. In a land of mortal humans, the Sarens were incredibly alone and that they outlived all around them. The first generation aged, but slowly, a human life, but a splash of time to them. Here was Karn, as near immortal as the Sarens, except that he simply relived a life of 20 years, endlessly. For a while, he would become a bridge between Clan Capuchin and the village of Devas. Karn could be counted on during these times to help allay suspicions, at least in regard to the Capuchins. Then the golem's other duties called him away, and when next Lyane saw him, they began again. It didn't matter that he couldn't remember the debt the Sarens owed him. She did. "No!" she yelled when Isark overextended to score against one guard, but left himself open to the striking sword of the second. "No, Isark! Not a parry! A riposte! Riposte! You turn the one blade back against itself, and that leaves you to still ready to defend against the second. Again! Do it again!" She glared at the young man, daring him to make a remark. Isark blew out a sigh of frustration and set himself back on his guard.
"Is there any way to accelerate his training?"
the golem asked after a moment's silent observation.
"To make him..."
Here the golem paused, trying to capture the words for what he meant.
"Better?"
Lyane had noticed that this time Karn's preoccupation with the student had taken an edge to it. "This boy is different somehow, isn't he?" she asked. "More than just being a commoner's son." She wondered if it had something to do with Urza Planeswalker's last visit to Benalia, or the unsettling tales of dark creatures preying upon the Benalish people. The Silver Man nodded.
"He is different, but not quite a commoner. One parent was a Capuchin noble, though he died before it could be proven. That leaves Isark a farmer for the rest of his life, trapped by the caste system. Percy Capuchin asked me to look over his training this year."
"He has the ability," she admitted, "but he must have the drive as well. You can't force a person's basic nature."
"Don't be sure,"
Karn said softly. Lyane glanced over. Karn studied Isark with a gesture of fondness. "Is it the Capuchin clan or is it Urza?" She felt certain now that the Planeswalker might have more to say on this than Percy and Capuchin. Karn stiffened, wary, but then whispered for her ears alone.
Urza.
That was enough for Liani. Any debt she owed Karn was far outweighed by that owed to Urza. He can be pushed to excel, Karn, but I'm not sure if it will help. A just cause isn't enough. He has to have a heart to defend it. If he cannot rise to my challenge, I may do more harm than good. On the field, Isark skipped back, arm clutched to his side against the pain of a solid hit. He tossed his sword down in disgust, not for his opponent, but for himself. I can't do it, Marshal! It's not that either one is stronger than I am, but they aren't committing to probing attacks I can turn easily. When a sword comes in driven behind their full weight, how am I supposed to match that with the strength of my arms alone? Liani looked over at the silver golem. She knew Karn liked the young man and that he must be weighing that fondness against his orders from the Capuchin noble and Urza. It surprised her how long he stood there, immobile, the sky's riot of sunset colors washing his silver sheen with a touch of red. Karn nodded.
Push him.
Liani drew her longsword and stepped into the practice circle. She threw it to Isark, who caught it properly by the hilt. An easy flick at her foot, and his abandoned weapon flipped into the air. She struck an unguarded position with it, anchoring her feet flat against the ground. Come at me. Isark studied her with wide-eye amazement. This sword will break that one in two, Marshal. If I let you do that, I deserve to bleed, she said, voice steel. You'll come at me, and she quoted him, driving with your full weight. She gestured with her weapon, and when he hesitated, she slashed at the air and screamed in her best commanding voice. Do it now! Isark leapt forward, as if not by his own volition, the gleaming sword whistling a quick feint and then driving in with a slashing attack that would hope to overpower any defense the Marshal could offer. Liani brought the smaller weapon up at an angle to the flat of Isark's blade, catching it in a spinning parry that she held into a full arc, until turning the blade back toward Isark's right shoulder. She kept her feet planted, not wanting to drive the sharp instrument back into the young man. She released it with extended arms to wrap the side of Isark's head with the back of her closed hand. The youth crumpled to the ground, dazed. Liani stood on her guard, ready for another attack, tossing the small sword down onto his chest. She stalked back to her place of instruction. Isark came reluctantly to his feet, one hand pressed to his new bruise. Do it again, she ordered him. Do it right.